This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order Wilds of Eldraine, you can use my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you my Archetype guide for Wilds of Eldraine Limited. It's almost pre-release time, so I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at the synergies within each of the format's color pairs. In this video, I'm not going to be talking about cards that are just powerful in every single deck. Instead, I'll be focusing on the cards that are particularly good within each of the 10 color pairs. Over the last week or so, I have, of course, done my full set review for the new format, so if you want to hear my thoughts about every single card in the format, that content is available too. Without further ado, let's take a look at our first color pair in Wilds of Eldraine, and we're starting with blue-green. So every color pair has at least one Signpost Uncommon in this set. A Signpost Uncommon is a card that has an identity of 2 colors that tells you what's going on in that particular color pair in terms of synergy. And in terms of blue-green, it's clearly ramp. We have Troyan Gutsy Explorer, which can tap for blue and green mana, and you can only spend that mana on things that cost 5 or greater or have X in their cost. So not only is it about ramp, it's about ramping into things with mana value 5 or greater in particular. Tempest Heart is the uncommon dual-colored adventure. Not all of them really stand in as Signpost Uncommons. Most of them are good, but a lot of them don't really have special synergy. They're just good cards in a particular color pair, but Tempest Heart is definitely a Signpost Uncommon because the creature side also cares about things that have a mana value of 5 or greater. It gets a +1/+1 counter anytime you cast those. So let's look at the ramp and payoff at common and uncommon in blue-green. So in addition to Troyan and Tempest Heart, we've also got Galvanic Giant, which can be a really expensive spell that will trigger things like Tempest Heart when you cast it as an adventure, and then when it's a creature, it likes it when you cast things that have a mana value of 5 or greater because it lets you tap and stun things when you do. Storm-Keld Prowler gets 2 +1/+1 counters anytime you cast something with a mana value of 5 or greater. Skybeast Tracker makes a food token anytime you do it. Up the Beanstalk draws you a card when it enters, and then draws you a card every time you cast a card with mana value 5 or greater. And then we've also got some ramp in addition to these payoffs. We've got things like Root Rider Fawn, which can tap for mana, Beanstalk Worm, which has an adventure that allows you to play an additional land, and then on top of that, it also happens to be a 5-cost creature, so it'll trigger all these things. And there's also Return from the Wilds, which lets you search up a basic land and put it into play tapped. There are some nice commons and uncommons to ramp into. Hamlet Glutton is a big creature that gains you life when it enters the battlefield. Storm-Keld Vanguard comes with an adventure, and then later in the game it's a big scary creature, and Archive Dragon is just a big scary creature. Some rares that are good in this deck, well, you've got Blossoming Tortoise, which ramps you when it enters the battlefield and when it attacks. You've also got Ingenious Prodigy, an X-costed creature. You're going to be able to pump a lot of mana into that, and if you have Troyan around, he can even tap for this kind of mana. Thunderous Debut, this is going to be one of the better decks for it. We'll see that there's another ramp deck in the format, but both this deck and that other ramp deck are going to be capable of actually generating the 8 mana they need for Thunderous Debut. And you're also more likely to have big creatures you're trying to ramp into, so when you cast it and look at your top 20, you're going to get some insane value. Elusive Otter. It's a creature on one side, but it's an X spell on the other, so I have it here. Bramble Familiar gives you another thing that can tap for mana, but then it's really cool because you can return it to your hand and then cast it as a really expensive adventure that potentially lets you reanimate something really big. The Goose Mother is a card that's going to be good everywhere, like you're going to be splashing this if you can in non-blue-green decks, but it happens to be exactly blue-green and an X spell, so I included it here. There's also Utopia Sprawl from the bonus sheet. This is a great ramp card in general. You pay 1 mana, stick it on a forest, and it can tap for additional mana. One particularly crazy sequence is that you can play Utopia Sprawl on turn 1, play Troyan on turn 2, and then play a 6-drop on turn 3. You know, if you play into a ramp creature like that, things get really crazy. So that's blue-green. It's about ramping, and mana value 5 or greater things are what it really keys off of. Let's move now to red-green, which is also a ramp deck, so that's why I have them back-to-back. This one keys off of power 4 or greater, though, so it's more interested specifically in creatures, and creatures with power 4 or greater. We again have 2 Signpost Uncommons here. One of them is Ruby Daring Tracker, who gets +2/+2 when she attacks if you have a thing with power 4 or greater, and she can tap for red or green mana. And Picnic Ruiner likes things with power 4 or greater, because if you have one when it attacks, it gets double strike. It also happens to come with an adventure that allows you to make something big enough to theoretically trigger that. So what are the 4+ power payoffs? Well, there aren't actually that many of them, interestingly. We've got Ruby and Picnic Ruiner, but after that, it's just Boundary Lands Ranger and Territorial Witch Stalker, which are both fine. You know, the Ranger lets you rummage every turn if you have something big, and the Witch Stalker gets +1/+0 and can attack. Honestly, none of that is that interesting. I think it's more of a sub-theme in this color pair than it was what we saw in blue-green, where it was more of a big theme, the whole power or mana value 5 or greater thing. Here, it's more of a sub-theme that's kind of there. Mostly, it's just a ramp deck. But the good news is, in red-green, maybe your theme, in addition to ramp, isn't as big, but you have access to more ramp, and that's because you have treasure. So, again, you still have Root Rider Fawn, Beanstalk Worm, returned from the wilds. Then you also get Grabby Giant that has an adventure that makes a treasure. You get Corvold and the Noble Thief, which if this format's slow enough, it's going to be really powerful because it generates 2 treasure and then lets you play a bunch of cards from your opponent's library. Redcap Thief also makes a treasure. Rares that work well here, well, they're pretty much the same as the ones we've already seen, but there's also Agatha. This deck is reasonably good at raising power, so Agatha does a pretty good job of decreasing the cost of activated abilities, most importantly her own, which can allow you to buff the whole board and give it trample. I have Charming Scoundrel here because it can make treasure. I also have Sneak Attack here because if you're in this deck, you're more likely to have something big that might be worth sneak attacking. And then there's also one more power 4 or greater payoff from the bonus sheet that you can sort of throw in with the other ones we saw. I'm putting all the bonus sheet cards, you already saw this with Utopia Sprawl, I'm putting them all on the rare spot because there's only one slot in each pack for them, and even the uncommon ones are going to be significantly rarer than your typical uncommon, so that's why I have them here. But Garruk's Uprising does care about power 4 greater, gives your things trample, draws you cards. So that's red-green, another ramp deck. Let's move now to green-white, which is an enchantment deck, and generally it's more interested in keeping enchantments in play on the battlefield. I make that distinction because the black-white deck is also an enchantment deck, but it's more interested in them going to the graveyard. So the Signpost uncommon here, we've really only got one. The green-white adventure creature is just like a good card. Doesn't have special synergy, so we're not going to talk about it here. But Sir Armont the Redeemer definitely has special synergy. She's a 5-mana 4/4, makes a monster roll token, and that's a huge theme for this color pair, these roll tokens. Because that enchants your creature, and then enchanted creatures you control get +1/+1 from Sir Armont. So in particular, she doesn't just like enchantments, she gives you one, and she really likes auras, and that is definitely a big part of this color pair. So the payoffs are Sir Armont. You've also got Tanglespan Lookout, which anytime an aura enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This includes those roll tokens, and there are a lot of ways to make those. So Tanglespan Lookout looks to be pretty well positioned for the format. Similarly, Rhyme for Reindeer likes it when they enter the battlefield. It allows you to tap something when they do. Slumbering Keep Guard scries 1 when an enchantment enters the battlefield, and it can buff itself equal to enchantments. I have Agatha's Champion here. It's not as obvious of a payoff as these other things which say the word enchantment. Well, I guess Agatha's Champion does too. It's just in the reminder text for Bargain. These roll tokens combine really well with Bargain. They're one of the really expendable things you can just throw away. And so I have Agatha's Champion here to stand in for all things with Bargain. We've also got Graceful Takedown, which is a green removal spell that gets better the more enchanted creatures you have. Redtooth Vanguard, which can come back from the graveyard when you play an enchantment. And Dutiful Griffin, which you have to sacrifice enchantments for, but if you have enough of those roll tokens around, bringing it back from the graveyard to your hand might be worth doing. There are some nice rares to support this color pair, including Yenna Redtooth Regent, who can copy enchantments, and when you copy auras, she untaps and scries too, so she really wants you to be copying them. Archon of the Wild Rose likes enchanted creatures, it makes them all into 4/4 flyers. A Tale for the Ages likes enchanted creatures, it gives them all +2/+2. Elvish Archivist likes it when enchantments enter the battlefield, because it draws you a card. You've also got Knightly Valor, a nice aura from the bonus sheet. Let's move now to Black-White, which is a graveyard enchantment deck. Neva, Stalked by Nightmares, is our Signpost uncommon here. When she enters, she can return a creature or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand, and whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Neva, then scry 1. So what payoffs do we have in addition to Neva? Well, we have Knight of Doves, who, when an enchantment goes to the graveyard, makes a 1/1 flyer. We have Savior of the Sleeping, that gets a +1/+1 counter when an enchantment goes to the graveyard. We have Warehouse Tabby, which makes a 1/1 rat token when an enchantment goes to the graveyard. We've got Wicked Visitor, which does 1 to your opponent when an enchantment goes to your graveyard, and Ashiok's Reaper, which draws you a card when an enchantment goes to the graveyard. So one thing to keep in mind here, I'm going to show you some ways to sacrifice enchantments in particular, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. One is that with role tokens, only one of them can be on your creature that you control. So one easy way, sort of free way sometimes, to put an enchantment in your graveyard is to put a role token on something that already has one, because then the token that's on it goes to the graveyard and it'll trigger all of these things. In addition to that, like I just said, there are other ways to get enchantments to go to the graveyard as well. There's the Dutiful Griffin, which we already saw, which lets you sack enchantments, so it'll trigger all those things twice. Well, maybe not all of them, it depends on how they're worded, but a lot of them it will trigger twice. We've also got kind of a pair here that isn't quite, a signpost, but having a common in Hopeful Vigil and Hopeless Nightmare, they're meant to be a mirrored pair, and they both really tell you what you want to be doing in this format, because they both have a little effect up front, and then you can sacrifice them to scry. But more importantly, you have the bargain mechanic. This is going to be the way you sacrifice enchantments the most. I mean, maybe the whole monster roll or roll tokens generally thing will happen more often, but bargain lets you sacrifice an enchantment, and sacrificing things like the Vigil or the Nightmare is great, because they've already given you value, and they even do something when you sacrifice them, and there is a bunch of bargain. So that's going to be the main way you really trigger all those things we saw a minute ago that key off of an enchantment going to the graveyard. There's some nice rares for this color pair. Ariette loves it when your creatures are enchanted, in particular because she drains X life at the end step, where X is the number of auras you control. Devouring Sugarmaw gives you a way to sacrifice enchantments because it demands you have one for it, or an artifact or a token every upkeep, otherwise it gets tapped. Lich Knight's Conquest pays you off the more expendable things you have around, and if those happen to be enchantments, you can reanimate more things. And Lord Skitter's Blessing gives you a Wicked Roll token, and then draws you extra cards if you control an enchanted creature. So black, white, and green, white, they have a lot of similarities. Green, white is more interested in the enchantments entering the battlefield. Black, white is more interested in the enchantments going to the graveyard, but you can see that there's a lot of overlap there. Let's move now to black, green, which is a food deck. Our signpost uncommon here is Greta, Sweet Tooth Scourge. She is a 3-mana 3/3 that makes a food, and then she has 2 abilities that let you give up food for value. One of them can put a counter on a creature. The other draws you a card and you lose a life. So let's look at some food payoffs at common and uncommon. So we've got Greta, of course. Then there's also Hollow Scavenger, which can make food, and then it can eat food to grow its stats. There is Knight of Sweet's Revenge. This is one I'm a little skeptical of. It'll be interesting to see how it pans out. But it makes food, then it makes all your food capable of tapping for mana, and then it has this really expensive ability that buffs your whole board equal to the number of food you control. A lot of the other food cards seem more aggressive than Knight of Sweet's Revenge, like Greta and Hollow Scavenger do. So it's a little bit awkward maybe, but if there's a deck for it, this will probably be it. There's also Tough Cookie, which makes food when it enters the battlefield, and it can animate non-creature artifacts, which means food, and turn them into 4/4s. It also happens to be a food itself. There's Welcome to Sweet Tooth, a saga that has a Chapter 2 that makes a food, and a Chapter 3 that puts a number of +1/+1 counters on one of your creatures equal to 1 plus the number of food you control. There's Sweet Tooth Witch, which makes a food when it enters, and you can pay 2 and sacrifice a food to make your opponent lose 2. And I have a bargain card here again as sort of a payoff, because if you have all these random food tokens, casting things with bargain and getting the extra value out of them is going to be easier. Rares that support what's going on here include Gumdrop Poisoner, who can make food and then gives -X until end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn when it enters. Obviously, food gains you life. Lich Knight's Conquest and Devouring Sugarmaw are here again. Sir Ginger, the Meal Ender, is here. Ginger is herself a food, and she likes it when artifacts go to the graveyard, which means, when you sacrifice food. Elvish Archivist, we already saw when talking about the enchantment decks, but it also works here because it also checks for artifacts, and when artifacts enter, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters. Food tokens are artifacts. I've got Necropotence from the bonus sheet. This is an incredibly powerful enchantment, and it gets way better if you have ways to gain life. Obviously, food gives you a way to do that. I have Sanguine Bond here. It's pretty hard to build around it. I mean, even though food is the main theme here, life gain is such a sub-theme in black-green. Like, you're going to be using your food for other purposes more often than not, as we saw. But if there's a deck where it works, probably the one that has a critical mass of food is where Singwin Bond will shine. Alright, that's black-green, it's the food deck. Let's move on to red-white, which is an aggro deck, and in particular, it cares about the celebration mechanic. Our signpost uncommon, our first one is Ash Party Crasher, 2 mana, 2/2 with haste. Then it has celebration. What celebration means is that this card likes it when 2 or more non-land permanents have entered the battlefield under your control during the turn, and if that's happened, you get to celebrate, and in this case, you get a +1/+1 counter on Ash when she attacks. Imidane's Recruiter is our adventure signpost uncommon. Not only does it come with an adventure called Train Troops that will turn celebration on for a turn, but also when it enters a battlefield, it gives +1/+0 and haste to your whole board. And obviously enough, if you're trying to trigger celebration, one of the best ways to do it is by making a card produce more than one body, which the Train Troops side can. So this is a go-wide aggro deck, but there are other ways to trigger celebration every turn. Let's talk about those now. So Imidane's Recruiter gives you one way to do it. Cards that make roll tokens also do it, assuming they're permanents, and most of them are. So Charmed Clothier, for example, gives you a 3/3 body, gives you a roll token. Suddenly, if you have cards with celebration, they're going to be doing their thing. Besotted Knight, if you can cast both halves together, does the same sort of thing. Same is true of Cursed Courtier, because it gives you a cursed roll token. We've also got Hopeful Vigil here again. We saw it in the black-white enchantment deck, but it also happens to get celebration going because it's an enchantment and it gives you a 2/2. Edgewall Pack gives you 2 bodies. Merry Bards is another card that gives you a roll token. Ratcatcher Trainee's Adventure makes 2 rat tokens. And Redcap Thief gives you both a creature and a treasure. So there are a bunch of cards with celebration. They're all pretty much entirely aggressive. So just curving out and playing things that turn celebration on like turn 4 is going to be the thing that you'd want to do in this deck a lot of the time. And it does look relatively doable. There are some rares that are well suited here. We've got Regal Bunnycorn, who cares about non-land permanents in play. It gets bigger the more of them you have. And this deck wants you to put those in play because of celebration. So it fits great here. 3 Blind Mice can give you up to 3 mice tokens and then buff your whole board. Exactly what you want to be doing here. Virtue of Loyalty can give you a token on turn 2 and then it buffs your whole board every single turn. That's exactly what you want to be doing here. Raging Battle Mouse has celebration itself. It gives +1/+1 to one of your creatures at the beginning of combat if you've celebrated. But importantly, the mouse also reduces the cost of the second spell you cast each turn, which will increase your chances of being able to make celebration do its thing. Redcap Gutter Dweller gives you 3 bodies, so it gets celebration going in addition to just being a really powerful card. Intangible Virtue, if there's a deck for it, this is probably it. You've seen that there's lots of tokens in this deck. You do need a critical mass of them for Virtue to really be worth it, but it doesn't seem impossible here. We've got Knightly Valor again, because not only does it make a token, but also it triggers celebration all on its own because it makes a 2/2 token. Impact Tremors could be interesting here. If you're putting a lot of creature tokens into play, it's going to do a lot of damage to your opponent. And then there is Godric Cloaked Reveler, a rare that has celebration. He becomes a dragon when you celebrate, which is pretty awesome. So that's red-white. It's your typical aggro deck, but it does have a bit of a focus on trying to play more than one non-land permanent a turn and get huge value out of that. Let's move to blue-red now, which is a spell deck, as it pretty much always is. We've got Johann Apprentice Sorcerer. Lets you look at the top card of your library anytime, and you can cast an instant or sorcery from the top of your library once a turn. That's really powerful. If you can jam enough instants and sorceries into your deck, he's going to be able to draw you a card on lots of turns, and that's amazing. The adventure signpost in this case is Frolicking Familiar, which has a really cheap spell on one side, which will trigger all of your spell payoffs, and then on the other side, likes it when you cast spells. One thing to note here that's good about this particular format for a spell deck is that there are more spells than it seems at first, because all adventures on the adventure side are instants or sorceries, so it's easier to hit this critical mass of spells in this set than it would be in most, at least when you first look at the breakdown of the set. Let's look now at the common and uncommon payoffs for doing things with spells. We've of course got Johann and Frolicking Familiar. There's also Aquatic Alchemist, which gets +2/+0 until end of turn when you cast a spell, and comes with an adventure that lets you return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to the top of your library. I have Chancellor of Tales here. It's going to be good in any blue deck because you're always going to have enough adventures for it to be a really good card. But I have it here because this deck is kind of extra interested in adventures, even compared to your typical deck in the format. Gadwick's First Duel has a Chapter 3 that is pretty crucial for the card to really feel like it's worth it. And that Chapter 3 lets you double an instant or sorcery spell that has mana value 3 or less. This deck will be able to do that better than most. Mocking Sprite reduces the cost of your instants and sorceries. Picklock Prankster comes with an adventure that mills 4, and then you can put an instant sorcery or fairy from among the cards you milled into your hand. This deck's going to have a lot of instants and sorceries, and as you can see, a lot of the spell payoffs just happen to be fairies too, so you have a pretty good chance at having that work out for you. Splashy Spellcaster gives you a Sorcerer Roll token when you cast a spell. Tenacious Tomeseeker, if you bargain, lets you return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. Frantic Firebolt gets better the more instants, sorceries, and adventures are in your graveyard. Hearth Elemental becomes cheaper the more instants and sorceries and adventures are in your graveyard. And Unruly Catapult untaps every time you cast an instant or sorcery, which means, you can ping your opponent multiple times a turn, in theory. Rares that work out here, well, we've got Elusive Otter. You're less likely to be able to cast the green side, but a 1-mana 1/1 with Prowess is really good in this deck. And splashing green, having one like Evolving Wilds in your deck to splash green for Grove's Bounty is not that hard to do either, and you're probably going to want to do it if you're playing the Otter. Imidane really only likes instants or sorceries that damage things, but this deck's going to be more interested in those than most. And then I also have Raging Battle Mouse, and that's because it works really well with adventures. It's more likely you can cast both sides of an adventure if you've got Raging Battle Mouse in play. So that's blue-red. It's a spell deck. It has a bit of an adventure sub-theme as well. Let's move now to black-red, which is a rat deck that also cares about sacrificing things. So our two signposts here. The first one is Totentan's Swarm Piper. 3-mana 2/3 that when it or any of your other creatures dies makes a rat token, and it can give rats Death Touch. You've also got Callous Sellsword, a 2-mana 2/2 who likes it when stuff dies because he enters with a +1/+1 counter for each creature of yours that did die. And the other side is an adventure called Burn Together, where you have a creature deal damage equal to its power to any other target, and then it gets sacrificed. So what other common and uncommon payoffs do we have? Well, there is Lord Skitter's Butcher, which is just a really good card, but it's going to be amazing in this deck because it can do all the things you want to do in this deck. So first, if you need more rat tokens, it can give you one of those. It also happens to be a rat itself. Second, if you have some rats that are already expendable that you want to sacrifice, you can do that with the second ability and get some nice value. And then if you have so many rats that you can just win the game with Menace, well, you can do that too. So Lord Skitter's Butcher is going to be really nice here. Voracious Vermin likes it when things die. It gets a +1/+1 counter when they do, and it makes a 1/1 rat when it enters the battlefield, in addition to being a rat itself. Twisted Sewer Witch is one of the best uncommons in this set. It comes into play, makes a 1/1 rat, and then puts a Wicked Roll token on every rat you have. And there are a lot of rats in this set. I'm not showing you an exhaustive list of everything that makes a rat token here. We're just seeing some of them. But there are so many rats in this set that usually it's pretty likely you have at least one other one in play when you play Twisted Sewer Witch. So you're going to get some amazing value. Tattered Ratter gives your rats +2/+0 until end of turn if they get blocked. And that's big because most of the rats in this set are tokens that can't block. And so, when they can't attack at all, it does feel pretty miserable, especially if you can't sacrifice them for value or something. And Tattered Ratter makes that less likely because your opponent's going to have a harder time chump blocking them if they're all 3/1s when they get blocked. Again, I have a bargain card here. It works really well with rat tokens. You're going to have expendable rat tokens around. Sacrificing them and making your Voracious Vermin bigger or getting a rat token is going to be pretty powerful on top of the bonus effect you get out of a card like Back for Seconds. Rares, well, we've got Lord Skitter Sewer King, who makes a rat at the beginning of combat every turn, is a rat itself. And it also hates on your opponent's graveyard. That's not a huge deal, but it is a rat bonus effect. Redcap Gutter Dweller, meanwhile, is a 4-mana 3/3 with Menace that makes 2 rats. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you can choose to sack a creature, and when you do, the Gutter Dweller gets a +1/+1 counter and basically draws you a card. So it makes rats, and it also likes sacrificing things, including those rats. Song of Totentons makes a bunch of rat tokens if you want it to. Tangled Colony is a rat, and when it dies, it makes a bunch of rats. Grave Pact is pretty sweet here. If you want to make it so your opponent can't really block your rat tokens, well, playing Grave Pact is a good way to make sure that happens, because if you're attacking with them or sacrificing them, you put your opponent in a really hard spot where they're going to have to sacrifice a real creature. There is a chance they have their own rat tokens or whatever, their own expendable things, but chances are you're going to be in a better position than they are for Grave Pact to work out for you. You've also got Vampiric Rites from the bonus sheet, lets you sack any creature, but in this deck you're probably more interested in sacking your rat tokens to draw cards. Goblin Bombardment lets you sack things to do 1 to any target. Impact Tremors likes it when you have creatures enter the battlefield. This format has a lot of cards in black-red that make multiple rat tokens. Raid Bombardment likes it when you attack with small creatures, and it's going to make all your rat tokens into much more formidable attackers. Shared Animosity buffs all of your rats equal to the number of other rats you control, gives them each +1/+0. It does it for other creature types too, but obviously in this deck, rats is where that's really going to matter. So that's black-red. It's a rat/sacrifice deck. Let's move now to blue-black, where we're talking about a fairy deck. Our main signpost uncommon is Obira, Dreaming Duelist, a 2-mana 2/2 with flash and flying. Whenever another fairy enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. We've also got Spellscorn Coven. It's not a fairy synergy of any kind, but it does happen to be a fairy, and it happens to be blue-black, so I have it here. What are the common and uncommon payoffs for this deck? Well, there's Obira, of course. We've also got Picklock, Prankster, who we saw before. This deck's also going to have a decent number of instants and sorceries. We'll see a few more fairy payoffs that are spells. So you're going to have a lot of instants and sorceries and a lot of fairies. So it's going to work out well here, just like it does in blue-red. We've got Spell Stutter, which is a counterspell that gets better the more fairies you have. Barrow Naughty, which gains lifelink as long as you control another fairy. Ego Drain, I think, is probably terrible and unplayable because you're, even in this deck, not always going to have a fairy, and when you don't, you 2-for-1 yourself with it, and its ceiling is still that it's a discard spell. But it's a fairy payoff, and if there's a deck it works in this format, obviously it's this one. Fairy Fencing is a really great removal spell that gets even more potent the more fairies you have. What rares fit in here? Well, we've got Talion's Messenger, who is a fairy payoff, because whenever you attack with 1 or more of them, you draw a card, then discard, and when you discard a card that way, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target fairy. Likeness Looter doesn't have any fairy payoffs per se, but it is a really powerful fairy, so I do have it here. Bitter Blossom makes you a fairy rogue creature token every turn. It will be particularly insane alongside the Signpost uncommon because it'll make your opponent lose 1, and then you'll get a fairy. And then there's Kindred Discovery, which has you name a creature type when it enters, and then when a creature of the chosen type enters or attacks, you get to draw a card. Blue-black is really the only blue deck that's going to have a creature type theme, so obviously this is the best deck for it. This brings us to our last color pair, which I think is the least cohesive of all of them. It is blue-white. So the main synergy here is supposed to be tapping. You have a card like Charade of Numbing Depths, who tells you that when it enters, it taps a creature an opponent controls, puts a stun counter on it, and then when you tap 1 or more untapped creatures your opponents control, you draw a card. So on its own, 4 mana, 2/3, stun something, draw a card. That's already good all on its own. Threadbind Click is only sort of a signpost uncommon. It doesn't give you an explicit payoff for tapping things, but it does have an adventure on one side that destroys tapped creatures. The main thing that makes this color pair less cohesive than the others is it has the least amount of support for actually tapping things. So this is it. You know, you have 3 uncommons, 4 uncommons, and we'll also see that there's a rare and a mythic, and that's all. Mostly, I think blue-white is going to be like a tempo deck, like it often is, with a tap sub-theme, where maybe you get a couple of these things to trigger, but overall, there's not that much. I mean, I'll still go over what we do have. We've got Solitary Sanctuary, an enchantment that enters, stuns something, and you get a +1/+1 counter anytime you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls. There's also Ice Rot Sentry, which can tap things on its own. When it attacks, you can pay 1 generic and a blue, tap a creature an opponent controls, and anytime you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, it gets +2/+1. It does trigger numerous times a turn, which is interesting. It can potentially get quite large if you're going crazy on tapping things, but like I said, this is it. There's no common support. There are common cards that tap things, but there aren't common payoffs for tapping things. We do have a really powerful mythic rare and a really powerful rare that fit in here. We've got Hilda of the Icy Crown, who every time you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, you can pay 1, and then you get an option between effects. Most often, you're probably just going to go for the 4/4, but you can also buff your whole board if you've gone really wide, or scry 2 and then draw a card. And then there's Hilda's Crown, which can tap things, and it also has a tap payoff ability where you can pay 3 generic and sack it and draw a card for each tap creature your opponents control. So those are the 10 color pairs in Wilds of Eldraine and the various synergies that exist between them. I think the set looks really fun. It's going to be fun to start playing it within the next few days. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including my entire set review for this new format, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.